A special session on highway funding wraps up, but many are wanting a more long-term solution. Sharp rate increases are proposed by companies on the state's insurance marketplace. Decades-old scandals in Arkansas get new discussion in the presidential campaign, while the man who led the investigation now has praise for the former president from Arkansas as he finds himself under scrutiny. Arkansas Week is just ahead.
Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.
This is Arkansas Week.
And thanks for joining us on this holiday weekend for Arkansas Week on AETN. I'm Michael Hiplin, News Director of 89.1 KUAR Public Radio in Little Rock. I'll be sitting in for Steve Barnes this week. Joining me on the panel, Andrew DeMillo is Capitol Correspondent for the Associated Press. Steve Bronner is an independent journalist, and Ernie Dumas is an independent journalist and columnist with the Arkansas Times. And this week, the legislature wrapped up a special session, the latest of several sessions. Guess lawmakers finally get a break after so many so far this year, including the fiscal session. But this one, Andrew, focused on highways. There was a little resistance to the governor's proposal. It took some legislative maneuvering, but in the end, he did eventually get his plan approved.
Yeah, that's correct. On Monday, the legislature gave final approval to the governor's plan, which it's aimed at getting more federal matching funds for the roads. The estimate is in the coming fiscal year, it's going to raise about $50 million in state money for highways and bring in another $200 million in federal funding for the roads. And the governor's plan, it's tapping into state surplus money, investment returns, and some other funds. And it got through pretty quickly. It was still minimum three-day session, but as you mentioned, there was some resistance to the plan, and it did take a little bit of maneuvering. They had to send it in the Senate to a different committee other than transportation because that panel had initially rejected the governor's plan. They took a vote to send it to the Revenue and Tax Committee, and it was able to get through. A lot of the resistance was basically just over the question of what's going to happen with roads in the long term. The State Highway Commission has talked about the number of needs that they've got over the next decade. This helps bring in some extra money, but it barely closes that gap at all. And there's been resistance from Democrats and quite a few Republicans too, saying where's the long term or even the intermediate plan for highways. And they were hoping to get something longer term than the governor's plan out of the session, and really kind of left unresolved what's going to happen with that, and really kind of sets the stage for debate next year over that and whether or not there's going to be any appetite for looking at a tax increase.
And at Monday's bill signing ceremony, the governor was a little bit defensive about it being called a short-term fix, saying, well, we're looking at 5 years, $1 billion, but said that if this wants to be addressed through tax increase possible for fuel, that's one suggestion. Steve, he's saying that this should actually go to voters or be brought up during the session next year, but any tax increase he would prefer go to voters.
That's right. He said that any kind of longer-term plan that raises more money for highways would need to come through an initiative. That means the voters would actually initiate the whole process, collect signatures and put on the ballot. No one argues that this is not enough for highways. The question is, where does the money come from? Nobody wants to pass a tax increase at this point. However, because our fuel taxes were not indexed to inflation, in effect, we get a tax cut every year. They were not indexed to inflation, so there hasn't been raised at the federal level since 1993 or at the state level since 2001. And of course, every year highways get more expensive to construct and maintain, and also cars become more fuel efficient. So less money is going in to highways, but there is not a political will to do anything about it. You could take more money from general revenues, but this is the first time, this highway plan that the governor passed this time is the first time that any money has come from general revenues to go to highways. That was another source of resistance to the program. It did get through, but that was, the other side was saying, wait a minute, if you take out from this piece of the pie, that affects other programs such as public schools.
Yeah, and you also had some concerns about rainy day funds being used here and surplus money. Arkansas has been good. The revenue has been above forecast for several years now for the most part. But the concerns that if we have an emergency, you won't have this surplus money available.
Yeah, I think we ought to reemphasize what Steve said, that this is the first time in history, or first time in modern times anyway, that you have funded highways out of general revenues. And that's basically what this does. It talks about surpluses and using interest on daily balances and so forth. But in effect, all of this is general revenues. And in the past, that's been a rigid rule by every governor that the highways are to be paid for by highway users through whether it's the motor fuel taxes, gasoline and diesel, or whether it's automobile and truck registration fees or whatever, that highways should be paid for by the people who use them and not in fact be paid for by the schools and colleges and so forth. And this is the first time that that's happened. Although they're talking about, one of the remedies I think that they're talking about as a permanent thing next year, some of the legislators are talking about carving away another $100 million directly out of the general revenue pot and appropriating it to highways. And in the past, they couldn't do it. The highway department has always had a powerful constituency. The suppliers, the contractors, economic development people that we need these highways, even the big truck industry. But in the past, the schools and the colleges and all the other beneficiaries of general revenues were powerful enough to resist that until this time it went through. So I think next session, we talked about that there's no support out there for higher taxes, but there was a little bit. Even among Republicans, there were a handful of Republicans who were willing to put their names on a bill to pretty sharply raise taxes. It would, in effect, raise taxes by repealing the exemption on gasoline and diesel from the sales tax. And if you remove that exemption, it would be a substantial tax increase. And there was quite a bit of support for it, but obviously not enough to get the simple majority in both houses to pass it. So anyway, it's a big issue, and the governor's going to have another big fight come January, I guess. And he'll prevail there too, because if he stands by the no tax thing, it won't happen. But another thing, rather than initiative, the legislature could refer it, could pass a gasoline tax or a sales tax or whatever, and simply refer it to the voters. And that's been tried a couple of times. Mike Huckabee did it to some extent in 2003 or 2005 or so forth.
Any word from lawmakers yet? Have they suggested anything about what they want to do next year? I mean, you had these competing proposals, some not even introduced, but a lot of ideas being tossed around. Have any said kind of what they would like to do next year?
You've got several different ideas that either were floated before the session or afterwards that are probably going to be on the table in some way. Bill Sample, who heads the Senate Transportation Committee, he and some other Republican senators had talked about the idea of an increase in fuel taxes. One of the sponsors of the governor's plan had talked about something that Ernie had mentioned was tapping into sales tax revenue related to vehicles. It'd be vehicle sales, auto parts, other things. Diverting that to highways gradually, with the cap of $100 million. That's going to face probably as much resistance as a tax increase would, just from Democrats, from higher education, from a lot of advocates. A lot of other ideas have been talked about. One idea that's been floated out there from one lawmaker was the idea of using the desegregation settlement payments that currently are earmarked to go toward reducing the grocery tax. This was one of the big agenda items for Governor Beebe was phasing out nearly all of the grocery tax, but using that DSEG money that is eventually going to be phased out, having that go toward cutting that tax. I've talked to one lawmaker who suggested instead have that money go toward highways, and then have a debate about whether or not to still do the grocery tax cut or do another tax cut, but use general revenue for it. So I think you're going to see several proposals on the table. I think you'll see some discussion about referring something to voters, and none of the options really lend themselves easily to consensus. And that's partly why I think you saw this plan that we had this time around is there really wasn't anything that they could get consensus for in a short period of time in a special session, and it's hard to see how the climate's really going to change that much on any of these issues.
But the Governor Hutchinson has had a pretty good run. He got this bill through. He got Arkansas Works through before. He got his budget through. So it seems like he's being able to exercise a good deal of control or influence at swaying legislators, even if it has to sometimes use some tricky legislative maneuvering.
But it's pretty easy to be successful when you're trying to get the legislature not to raise taxes. I think any of us might be successful in doing that as well if we were governor. I think it's probable that the governor does not want to raise taxes in his first term as governor. I mean, he's a Republican, and that's a rigid proposition with the Republicans. You do not raise taxes. So I think he wants to get through his first term without raising taxes. Second term, after he gets reelected in 2018, I guess, right? Then we may see some tax. That's what happened with Mike Huckabee. Remember, after he got reelected in 2002, you had a whole raft of tax increases that he signed. Sales tax, cigarette tax increases, motor fuel tax increases, all of which he passed after and during his second term, but he wasn't going to face voters again.
Perhaps the second most controversial item brought up during this special session was the so-called efficiency bill. Andrew, explain a little on this.
Yeah, and this was in a lot of ways this kind of ended up overshadowing the fight on highways. This was a 105-page bill, billed as an efficiency bill. Basically, it was a government reorganization bill, and the two most contentious parts of it were a part of it moved the History Commission under the Department of Arkansas Heritage, and there was another provision in there that basically gave the governor more control over the governor's mansion and more control over what he can do at the governor's mansion. This was a proposal that wasn't filed until right before the session began. And you had a lot of objections from Democrats who criticized this measure. First of all, for it even coming up during a session that was supposed to focus on highways, and also taking up something that was this involved. This 105 pages being dropped right before the session. Really questioned the need for doing it in a special session versus waiting until next year. It was able to get through, but it faced some really strong opposition from Democrats, and I think it's going to still be. Obviously, it's still getting a lot of scrutiny right now, and going to face a lot more criticism, over this move.
And much of it was very uncontroversial. Actually, it was about closing task forces that don't meet anymore, or maybe reorganizing how those task forces are, and that probably would have not been a big deal. The bill came down literally the day of the session, and it was 105 pages. Most legislators did not have a chance to read it. And it did include the areas with the History Commission, moving it to a different department, which is not urgent. It might be important, but it's not urgent. Also, the Mansion Commission coming under the governor's a lot more influence, and that, as we learned today, that was the mansion has some problems, and that is where a family lives, and clearly there's some unhappiness with how things are being taken care of, and this bill is moving that along, but it all happens so quickly without a whole lot of debate, and that's where a lot of the controversy is.
And the governor really wanted to keep this session focused on highways, but there were about a dozen other items. He was able to keep one item from being brought up about bathrooms and LGBT people, and that's looking like might come up next year.
Yeah, the governor had said he was opposed to having legislation come up that would have been in response to the Obama administration directive dealing with transgender student access to bathrooms, locker rooms. You had some lawmakers who were floating the idea of trying to pass some kind of legislation, possibly similar to what North Carolina's law, which has been the target of boycotts and a lawsuit from the Justice Department. The governor basically said he didn't think it was appropriate to bring it up during the special session. There wasn't enough time to vet the issue, but he's predicted this is likely going to be one of the issues coming up next year. You've already had some lawmakers say they're going to bring up some kind of legislation dealing with this, and it's going to be interesting to see where the governor comes down on this. Given his opposition to the bathroom directive. But also the way he handled the religious objections law last year, asking the legislature to revise that measure because of complaints that was discriminatory. I imagine that any measure dealing with the bathroom issue is going to face some of the same complaints, and probably some of the same players. Big businesses who are going to object to what it could do depending on how it's crafted. So we could see. We could see kind of a sequel of the religious objections fight this time around with even more attention on Arkansas.
We had some eyebrows raised this week when it was announced 4 of the 5 insurers offering policies on Arkansas's insurance marketplace are proposing rate increases of at least 10%, some, Steve, as high as 23%.
Yeah, Blue Cross is like 14.7%, and QCA and Qual Choice are up close to 24%. This is the insurers say that this is because of rates, prices are going, or costs are increasing quicker than they had in the past. There's more utilization of services. There is prescription drugs are increasing in prices. There's more catastrophic claims of more than $50,000. There are some things that are going away through the Affordable Care Act and through Arkansas that helped insurers deal with this. And another interesting thing, last year when the state purged the rolls of so many people who were getting health insurance, who were insured but either weren't living in Arkansas or weren't living at all. They were dead, but they were still on the rolls, and the insurance companies were getting premiums for this, but they weren't having to pay out any claims. In fact, Blue Cross, they lost 25,000 people like that. Those were all they're getting premiums, but they're not paying a whole lot for the health care. They were having to adjust in part because of that change.
The governor and the state insurance commissioner, Alan Kerr, said they do not believe there is a substantial justification for these increases. How will this be vetted? How will they look at this?
Well, they will go through a process. They've got basically they're going to get more information from the insurance companies, and they'll determine if it's justified. One thing is that while the statement from the commissioner was that it's basically saying at this point we don't think that an increase is justified. That doesn't mean that will be the final decision. There could be a different way of looking at it once they see what's laid out. But probably it could very well be that this is on the high end, and that there will be a rate increase. There will be a rate increase, but maybe not what's been requested.
Well, it was a little bit like a flashback this week as we had scandals from 2 decades ago brought up again. Whitewater, something that seemed like it was long put to bed, brought up again. You had Vince Foster. You had things, Ernie, that were extensively investigated by Ken Starr. And I was there the day he arrived in Little Rock to take over the investigation in 1994. Spent years looking into these matters, but conspiracy theories remain. And Donald Trump, the Republican presidential candidate, who now has the numbers he needs, by the way, to get the nomination, is looking at this as potential material against Hillary Clinton.
We're going to get in Arkansas, we're going to get to relive the glorious 1990s that everybody where there's so much attention was focused on Arkansas when Bill Clinton ran for president and throughout his presidency, owing largely to the Whitewater investigation run by Kenneth Starr for most of its duration. And Donald Trump, now not just the presumptive nominee, but almost certainly the nominee, has indicated all along that he's going to resurrect all of this stuff, and that he's going to make Bill Clinton and Whitewater and all of that the central part of his campaign in the fall against Hillary Clinton. And sure enough, just last week he resurrected the old conspiracy that Bill and Hillary Clinton or somebody in the Clinton administration arranged the murder of Vince Foster, very dear close friend of Bill and Hillary Clinton and Hillary's law partner here at the Rose firm in Little Rock, and suggesting that when his body was found in Fort Marcy Park about 6 months after the inauguration, that it really wasn't a suicide, but that it was that he was murdered to kind of keep him quiet about whatever he knew about the Clintons. And that was a pretty popular theory, and in fact, that was the reason for the whole Whitewater investigation. The White House kind of, back when Vince Foster, his body was found, there were questions about, well, what did he owe? What did he know? And the White House kind of mishandled at the time. The White House General Counsel said, no, we're not going to let investigators see any records in this office until we go through and separate the personal. That raised suspicions, and then eventually Bill Clinton said, okay, let's get this behind us, appoint an independent counsel, and we'll be done with this thing. And sure, of course, 8 years later, they were done with it. So Donald Trump said, well, I'm not suggesting that Bill and Hillary had Vince Foster murdered, but nevertheless, there were these reports back then. And he does that on other issues as well, as we know. But at any rate, that was in the Washington Post, and Vince Foster's sister, Sheila Anthony, a wife of a former Arkansas congressman, writes a strong letter to the Washington Post in which she says, how dare this man resurrect the misery that we all experienced back then. And she goes and talks about his suicide, and she had talked to him all along about he was depressed and wanted to get help, psychiatric help, but he was afraid to do it because he would lose his security clearance at the White House. So, and she gave him the names of 3 psychiatrists he should go see privately. And names of those 3 psychiatrists were found in his pocket when they found his body. All that's been resurrected. And then the other thing that was fascinating is that on the same day, the New York Times carried a long piece about Kenneth Starr appearing on a panel about the presidency in which he virtually exonerated, it seemed almost to exonerate Bill Clinton, praised his presidency, praised Clinton personally for his honor and dignity and compassion for people, and kind of apologized for running this long investigation that went on all those years. And he just referred to it as that unpleasantness, but we've got it behind us. So that's resurrected all of that as well. And then the next day, of course, 2 or 3 days later, he was fired as president of Baylor, demoted to chancellor, all his operating powers removed, because he had suspected anyway, of trying to cover up the sexual assaults by athletes on the Baylor campus. So you've had all of that this week. We're going to see a lot more of that as in the next 5 months, I guess. We're going to relive Whitewater and all of those things again. The boys on the tracks, the Mina drug scandal, and all of those wild conspiracy theories that we all endured back in the 1990s. We're going to see it again, I'm afraid. And I think Donald Trump has suggested he's going to resurrect all those things.
Yeah, well, the national media was largely consumed with just the irony of a, sex-related scandal, kind of now coming back to Ken Starr after the repeated investigations. It was Clinton lying under oath that eventually led to his impeachment. But Starr also expressed concern about the tone of politics now. And to a degree, it's what began during the Clinton years by those who wanted to tear Clinton down by any means possible.
Yeah, I think all of this didn't start then, but it really leapfrogged, I think, during the Kenneth Starr investigation. All of this hysteria in politics and the tone of politics, I think, dramatically changed. It was already bad, but it changed dramatically in the 1990s. And he seemed to sort of apologize for that. He didn't quite accept his role in that, but he said it's terrible that politics has reached this stage that we can't sit down and talk about things, work out compromises, and work things out together. So he's not the only one who's been saying that, but for Kenneth Starr to say that, I think it was something else.
Well, we'll see what plays out here in the months ahead. I'm Michael Hiplin. Thanks for watching Arkansas Week, and we'll see you next week.
Arkansas Week is made possible in part by the Arkansas Times, keeping you informed by covering people, events, and politics in Arkansas. By FM 89, KUAR in Little Rock, with in-depth news reporting, analysis, and discussion each weekday.